On his deathbed in Normandy, he handed out the spoils. He gave his eldest surviving son, Robert, his Duchy of Normandy. But it was the younger son, the red-haired William Rufus, who the conqueror willed should be acclaimed King of England. And the youngest, Henry, was told he would have to be content with £5,000. But Henry was his father's son. Content with £5,000? Was that likely? The key to the plotting that followed was that, of course, none of the brothers was content. Henry stirred the brew of resentment that made Robert try to take the kingdom of England from William, and William try to take the Duchy of Normandy from Robert. And Henry was always changing sides, weakening them both. Eventually Robert, tiring of the whole struggle, decided it would be more satisfying to fight Saracens than his brothers, and went off on crusade. William was now secure and powerful, and Henry changed his policy. He was now William Rufus's very best friend. The Bishop of Lincoln later said that when Henry praised anyone, he was sure to be plotting that person's destruction. It does seem as though Henry concentrated on quietly stirring up discontent among churchmen and barons in England, which was not hard, as William Rufus needed their money and had little to offer in return, except to give to some what he'd taken from others. And besides, William Rufus wasn't their kind of chap. He didn't marry, he had no children, and as one chronicle puts it,
all things that are loathsome to God and to earnest men were customary in this land in his time. And therefore he was loathsome to well nigh all his people, and abominable to God.
Which is, of course, homophobic chronicle speak for being gay. On the 2nd of August, in the year 1100, both William and Henry were hunting separately in the New Forest. It was the last day of William Rufus's life. No one knows who fired the arrow that ended the reign of William Rufus. His companion Tyrrell immediately fled and disappeared abroad. William's body was abandoned where it lay, at a spot still marked by this stone. The next day, local peasants took it in a cart to Winchester. Henry had arrived before them. Winchester was where the royal treasure was kept. He demanded the treasury keys from the guards. They refused to hand them over, saying that Robert, his elder brother, was the rightful heir. Henry drew his sword and declared that no one should stand between him and his father's sceptre. Resistance collapsed, and when the peasants arrived with their cart, the lords of England were busy electing Henry as their king, the first elected ruler of England since Harold Godwinson. The Bishop of Winchester refused to give the corpse a Christian burial. Out of respect for his royal status, William Rufus was nevertheless interred under the cathedral tower, and when that collapsed a few years later, everyone said, "Told you so." Henry's coronation at Westminster was an attempt to ensure his authority to rule. He was 32 years old. His father had won the country by force of arms, and his barons backed him for rich rewards. But why would anyone want a king now? Alongside his sanctification by the church, he issued a charter promising that he would not overtax the church or his tenants-in-chief, and that they must treat their tenants as he treated them. He claimed that the crown changed his nature. He was no longer an ordinary human being. As the anointed king, he held special, divinely granted powers. His touch was supposed to cure scrofula, swollen neck glands from tuberculosis. This magic power, which became known as touching for the king's evil, was practiced by English monarchs for the next 700 years as proof of their divine authority. He also quite smartly understood that it was a good idea to promote new people to positions of power. Those who were already great barons didn't need a king, but men on the make would support him. By the time Robert was able to mount a challenge to Henry, it stood no chance. He agreed to recognize Henry as King of England in exchange for a pension. Of course, it didn't last. Henry ended up invading Normandy in 1106 and imprisoning his brother for the rest of his life. This is his tomb in Gloucester Cathedral. The question of who was entitled to succeed to the crown was still, when you came down to it, a matter of brute force. But Henry's victory had a profound symbolic meaning because it changed the status of the English crown. Under his father, England had been a property seized and owned by the Duke of Normandy. Now, Normandy was a property seized and owned by the King of England. Henry was a naturally cheery person. Just after his coronation, he married Edith, the daughter of an English woman and of the King of Scotland, and he encouraged the Normans he was promoting to marry English women. The great barons regarded this with contempt and referred to their king and queen as Godric and Godiva, a style statement which roughly translates as Sid and Gladys. As sturdy warriors, they also didn't appreciate the fact that he was literate in 3 languages. His other nickname, Henri Beauclerc, means Henry the Swat. But those great barons were having their power undercut as Henry recruited his government officers and judges from the church. He supervised his kingdom by moving his court from one centre to another. It was a great travelling performance, like a circus, with no permanent home. He spent half his time in Normandy, but when he was away, the kingdom was run by a totally reliable civil servant, Roger, the Bishop of Salisbury, who was called the Justiciar. The idea of government by a system rather than by a man was beginning to take shape. He sent judges on their own tours of the country and enforced the laws harshly, which seems to have been quite popular according to the chroniclers. But his punishments were often based on the idea that people were guilty until proved innocent, and there was no time to do that. Were England's lanes really full of blinded and mutilated men muttering, "Firm but fair"? You'd think so from the sources we have. They liked a strong king. And he managed to keep the treasury well stocked with money, which meant he could buy loyalty when he needed to. The key to this was his system for checking his income. Twice a year, sheriffs and royal officials from all over England had to bring their money to be counted by being shunted around in piles on a checkered cloth like a chessboard. Checked. It was called the Exchequer. The system worked so well that the cabinet minister in charge of the nation's finances is still called the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and we still use paper chitties called cheques. By a combination of force and diplomacy, he controlled and to some extent colonised Wales. Relations with Scotland were fine. 3 of his wife's brothers became kings there. England was becoming a peaceful, stable and successful kingdom. Henry sent his young daughter Matilda to Germany to marry the Holy Roman Emperor, and in 1116 he held a great assembly at Salisbury where all the barons, nobles and bishops swore homage to his son William as his successor to the crown. In 1120, young William was a star, an enthusiastic warrior, a keen huntsman and the heir apparent. He'd been in Normandy with his father fighting the King of France, and the whole party was returning to England. William and his pals were travelling in a brand new ship, the White Ship. They were the 12th century English jet set, the millionaire knightly lads who were heirs to most of England and Normandy. Once they got on the ship, there was a terrific party. Alcohol was taken, and how? Soon it became really rowdy. The Hooray Henrys yelling at one another and throwing off a bunch of priests who'd come to bless the voyage. William's cousin, Stephen of Blois, had an upset stomach, and he felt he needed a bit of peace and quiet, so he decided to go ashore and take a later ship. By the time they got to sea, it was already dark and the other ships were way ahead. The wind was light. William decided to catch up with the king and ordered the chaps to start rowing. The master was as drunk as anyone else, so they began to speed into the dark, 50 oars pushing this state-of-the-art longboat at a terrific lick. That was when they sailed straight into a rock and smashed the ship open. The rock Barfleur was a well-known hazard to navigation.